One, the accident. She didn't mean to send it. But once it was sent, there was no way to pretend it didn't say everything. Before we go any further, pause with me. If stories about quiet pain, emotional absence, and the things we hide even from ourselves resonate with you, subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast now. Because what comes next isn't loud. It's honest. And it stays with you. Alright, let's begin. It happened on a night that didn't ask for attention. No rain on the windows. No music swelling in the background. Just a dim room and the soft glow of a phone. Lucy Harper sat on the edge of her bed, shoulders relaxed in the way people do when they're exhausted from holding themselves together. The apartment was silent. Not peaceful silence, but the kind that listens. She wasn't trying to confess anything. She wasn't lonely enough to reach out. She was simply clearing space. Scrolling through her camera roll, deleting moments that no longer needed to exist. Blurry photos. Accidental screenshots. Things she'd meant to forget. Then she stopped. There was an image she hadn't planned on seeing tonight. A close-up. Her shoulder. Bathroom light. A pale scar, thin, uneven, resting quietly on her skin. Not dramatic. Not shocking. Just true. Her finger hovered. She didn't think. She didn't feel brave. It was a reflex. Tap, send. And the name at the top of the screen wasn't someone safe. Not a friend. Not family. It was Ethan. Her chest tightened instantly. Time slowed, not gently, but sharply. Because fear doesn't rush you. It makes you wait inside yourself. Delivered. That single word felt heavier than it should have. Lucy stared at the screen, heart counting seconds she didn't want to count. A familiar thought surfaced, soft. Practiced. Cruel. Now he'll see it. Now he'll know what you never say out loud. And then, he'll pull away. She tried to type. Deleted it. Typed again. Deleted that too. Her hands moved as if she could erase the moment by disappearing from it. Nothing came back. No typing bubble. No reaction. Just silence. And silence, when you've lived with emotional absence long enough, doesn't feel neutral. It feels like abandonment rehearsing itself. Lucy placed the phone face down on the bed. She pressed her fingers lightly against the scar, as if grounding herself in proof that she was still here. Outside, a car passed. Somewhere, someone laughed. The world continued, unaware that a single message had cracked something open. Then the phone vibrated. Once. Not a call. Not a paragraph. Just a reply. And in that moment, Lucy realized. The accident wasn't sending the photo. The accident was what it invited back. To the pause before meaning. The phone lay still. Too still. Lucy didn't pick it up right away. She knew that pause. That small, suspended moment where meaning hasn't arrived yet, but your body already knows something is coming. Seconds stretched. Not loudly, but thinly. Like time had been pulled apart. She stared at the ceiling, counting nothing, trying not to imagine the shape of his thoughts. Was he confused? Was he uncomfortable? Or was he already learning how to leave, quietly, politely, without explanation? The worst part of waiting isn't the silence. It's the space you fill with yourself. Lucy's mind began doing what it had learned to do early: rewind. Re-edit. Soften the truth before someone else could harden it. It's just a scar. He'll think it's nothing. You shouldn't have sent it. You always send too much. Her chest felt tight, then hollow. A familiar rhythm. The body remembering old lessons. This pause. It wasn't new. It had followed her through conversations, relationships, entire years of her life. The pause after she spoke honestly. The pause before someone decided whether she was worth staying present for. She reached for the phone. Stopped. Set it back down. Because picking it up felt like begging the moment to define her. Across the city, somewhere she couldn't see, Ethan was reading the image again. He didn't react the way people expect men to react. There was no shock. No rush to fix. No instinct to minimize it. Just stillness. He noticed the way the light caught the scar. How close the photo was taken. How unguarded it felt. This wasn't a message meant to be sent. That much was clear. And somehow, that made it heavier. Ethan felt something stir. Not attraction, not pity. Recognition. He knew this kind of exposure. The kind that slips out by accident. Because holding it in takes too much energy. He set his phone down. Too. Not to ignore it. But because he needed to feel what was rising before he answered. The pause thickened. Two people, holding the same silence from opposite sides. Both trained by different losses. To expect disappearance. Lucy wondered if this was the moment she'd replay later. The moment before she learned, once again. That honesty costs more than silence. Ethan wondered something else. Whether responding carefully was kinder. Or whether truth, unfiltered, was the only thing that wouldn't feel like abandonment. The phone remained quiet. And in that quiet, meaning hadn't arrived yet. But it was forming. Free defining abandonment, her side. Lucy didn't call it abandonment at first. She had softer words for it, safer ones. Busy. Not a big texter. Just tired. Not good with feelings. Words that let someone stay, without actually being there. Because the truth was, she didn't grow up with people who left loudly. No slammed doors. No dramatic goodbyes. The people in Lucy's life stayed in the room. And still disappeared. They'd be sitting right there, eyes on the TV, hands on a steering wheel, fingers on a phone. But not looking at her. Not hearing her. Not arriving. And a child learns fast. If your pain doesn't get a response, you stop showing it. Abandonment, for Lucy, wasn't someone walking out. It was someone staying, and making her feel like she was talking to air. It was the pause after she said, "I'm not okay." And someone replied, "You'll be fine." Already halfway turned away. It was birthdays that happened around her. Not for her. It was a hug with no warmth. Love you, that sounded like a habit. And later, it became men. Men who didn't cheat. Men who didn't scream. Men who didn't hit. Men who simply didn't meet her. They listened with their eyes somewhere else. They held her, but their bodies felt absent. They kissed her like they were thinking about tomorrow. And Lucy learned to interpret small things as warnings. A message seen but unanswered. A call returned hours later. A shift in tone that nobody admitted. She learned to become an expert in the temperature of someone's attention. Because when attention disappears, you start to panic quietly. That's the part people don't talk about. Abandonment doesn't always feel like heartbreak. Sometimes it feels like you're embarrassing yourself. For wanting something basic. A reply. A look that says, "I'm here." A question asked without irritation. And so Lucy adapted. She became low maintenance. She became easy. She became the girl who didn't need much. She stopped asking, "Where are we?" She stopped saying, "I miss you," first. She stopped calling when she felt lonely. Because loneliness, to her, sounded like weakness. And even now, in this moment, the phone face down on her bed, the message hanging in the air. Her first instinct wasn't anger. It wasn't blame. It was self-editing. I shouldn't have sent that. I shouldn't have needed comfort. I shouldn't have shown him a piece of me that wanted to be held. Because when you've been abandoned emotionally, you don't just fear being left. You fear being too human. You fear the moment someone realizes your heart still wants something. And decides it's easier not to deal with you. Lucy touched the scar again, lightly. Not because it hurt. But because it reminded her. There are marks that form not from what happened once. But from what never happened at all. The comfort that never came. The words that were never offered. The presence that always stayed just out of reach. That was abandonment. On her side of the story. For defining abandonment, his side. Ethan didn't think of himself as someone who abandons people. In his mind, abandonment was obvious. A suitcase by the door. A number blocked. A goodbye that slams like a bruise. He didn't do those things. He stayed polite. He showed up. He kept the calendar. He paid attention to details people could point at and say, "See, he cares." But emotional abandonment is quieter. It looks like being present while never truly arriving. Ethan learned that early. Not because someone left him, but because someone stayed and taught him that needs were dangerous. In his childhood home, feelings were handled like spills. Clean them up fast. Don't make a mess. Don't ask why the floor is already wet. If Ethan was sad, someone would say, "Don't be dramatic." If he was scared, someone would say, "Be a man." If he needed comfort, he was met with a look that said, "We don't do that here." So he adapted. He became impressive, reliable, contained. A boy who could swallow everything and still make good grades. A teenager who could smile at dinner while feeling like a stranger in his own skin. A man who could listen without letting anything touch him. People called it strength. He called it control. And control kept him safe. Because when you let someone close, they start to see you, and being seen is the first step toward being asked for something. Time. Tenderness. Accountability. Truth. Things Ethan didn't know how to give without feeling trapped. So he learned a different kind of leaving. He wouldn't walk out. He would fade. He'd respond, just enough. He'd care, at a distance. He'd offer solutions instead of presence. If someone cried, he'd fix the problem. If someone asked, "Are you okay?" he'd say, "I'm fine." And mean, "I'm closed." He wasn't trying to punish anyone. He wasn't trying to be cruel. He simply didn't know how to stay emotionally without feeling like he was losing himself. And in relationships, that looked like absence. He'd be there, but his mind would be elsewhere. He'd hold a woman, but his chest would stay locked. He'd say, "I miss you." But he wouldn't ask, "How are you really?" Because that question opens doors. And Ethan had spent his whole life building walls that looked like doors. Abandonment, on his side, wasn't a dramatic exit. It was a refusal to enter. A refusal to sit in discomfort long enough to meet another person's reality. And the hardest part, the part he never admitted out loud, was that he didn't feel nothing. He felt too much. He just didn't have language for it. So he turned feelings into silence. Silence into distance. Distance into, "I'm just busy." That was the lie people believed. And it was convenient. Because it made his unavailability sound temporary instead of foundational. Now, staring at Lucy's photo, Ethan felt the old reflex rise. Close the door. Make it small. Turn it into something manageable. But the scar in the picture didn't look manageable. It looked intimate. Like trust, accidentally offered. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan saw something clearly. If he stayed silent now, it wouldn't just be space. It would be abandonment. Not the kind that leaves with footsteps, but the kind that leaves someone alone while you're still right there. 5. Inner adaptation, becoming low need. Lucy didn't wake up one day and decide, "I'm going to need less." It happened the way water carves stone. Slow, quiet, and permanent. At first, it looked like maturity. She stopped double texting. Stopped asking, "Did I do something wrong?" Stopped letting her voice shake when she needed reassurance. She told herself it was confidence. That she was secure. That she didn't need constant proof. But beneath that was training. Because when you ask for something, and it doesn't come, you learn the pain of reaching. So you reach less. Lucy learned to preempt disappointment. To lower her needs before anyone else could. To become the kind of woman men described as easy to be with. Which really meant, she doesn't ask me to show up emotionally. She became fluent in shrinking. If she missed someone, she waited. If she felt jealous, she swallowed it. If she wanted affection, she turned it into a joke. "Oh, don't worry about me," she'd say. smiling. I'm fine. And she meant, I don't want to be too much. She learned the art of asking for the smallest version of what she wanted, so that even a crumb could feel like a meal. A late reply became, he's busy. A cancelled plan became, no big deal. A cold tone became, I'm overthinking. Because if she named it, she'd have to risk hearing the truth. And the truth was what she feared most. That her needs were inconvenient. That tenderness was a chore. That love required something she didn't deserve. So she built a personality around being low need. She became the girl who never cried in front of anyone. The woman who said, it's okay, too quickly. The partner who offered space before it was requested. And people praised her for it. You're so chill. You're so independent. You're not like other girls. They said it like a compliment. And Lucy smiled like it didn't cost her anything. But inside, it cost her everything. Because being low need isn't peace. It's self-abandonment with good manners. It's choosing silence over honesty. Because honesty once made you alone. It's watching someone pull away. And deciding you'd rather disappear first. So it won't hurt as much. Lucy became excellent at disappearing. She'd say, good night, before she said, I miss you. She'd say, no worries, when she wanted, please stay. She'd say, do what you want, when she meant, choose me. And the cruelest part? She started believing that this was love. That love meant being easy. Low maintenance. A soft background presence that never demanded a spotlight. But a heart doesn't stop needing. It just learns to need, in secret. That's why the photo mattered. Not because it showed a scar on her skin. But because it revealed something she'd been hiding even from herself. A part of her still wanted to be held. A part of her still hoped someone would look at her pain and stay. And now, with Ethan? With the message hanging between them, Lucy wasn't just waiting for his reply. She was waiting to find out whether she was allowed to need without being left. 6. Inner adaptation. Becoming unavailable. Ethan didn't become unavailable because he didn't care. He became unavailable because caring felt like a doorway. And he had learned, a long time ago, that doorways lead to rooms where people ask you to stay. So he built a life where nothing could pull him too close. He answered texts, but not too fast. He made plans, but not too far ahead. He spoke kindly, but never with language that could be held against him. It looked like calm, like confidence, like a man who had standards. But inside, it was a system, a way of living that kept him from being cornered by emotion. Because emotion, to Ethan, was not soft. It was expensive. It cost sleep. It cost control. It cost the illusion that he could handle everything alone. So he did what so many people do when they've been shamed for needing. He made himself unreachable. Not physically. Not obviously. Just emotionally. He'd show up to dinner. He'd smile. He'd ask questions that sounded thoughtful. But when the conversation turned toward the heart, he'd redirect it. To work. To logistics. To jokes. If someone said, I feel like you're not really here, he would say, I'm right in front of you. And technically, he wasn't lying. That's what unavailability is. It's truth without presence. It's saying the correct words, while keeping the deeper part of you locked somewhere safe. Ethan learned to treat intimacy like weather. Something that happens around him. Something he can acknowledge without stepping into. When a woman leaned in emotionally, Ethan's first instinct wasn't to lean back. It was to measure distance. How much closeness is safe? How much of myself can I give without losing the parts one need to survive? He didn't trust the moment when someone loved him. Because love always sounded like a future debt. One day, you're adored. The next day, you're expected. And Ethan had been expected to be strong for so long that he didn't know what tenderness felt like without pressure. So he became good at being impressive. A man you could admire. A man you could rely on. But not a man you could rest against. He kept his voice steady. His tone gentle. His life full. Busy became his shield. Sorry, I've got a lot going on. Let's do it another time. Work's crazy right now. Words that sound temporary, but hide something permanent. Because what he never said was, if you get too close, I will panic. If you ask me to feel in front of you, I won't know how. If you need me emotionally, I might disappear, not to hurt you, but to breathe. That's what made it so confusing to the people who loved him. He didn't leave. He didn't betray. He just wasn't reachable when it mattered. And that kind of absence can make someone doubt their own reality. Now, with Luce's photo on his screen, Ethan felt his usual reflex rise. Make it small. Make it casual. Turn it into nothing. He could send a polite line. A safe emoji. A quick, hope you're okay. And go back to being the man who never steps too far into anyone's pain. But the photo wasn't asking for politeness. It wasn't asking for smooth. It was asking for presence. And Ethan realized something he hadn't admitted in years. His unavailability wasn't just a trait. It was an adaptation. A scar you can't see. A habit that looks like strength. Until someone needs you to stay. 7. The cost of staying, her body remembers. Luce's body remembered things her mouth never said. Not as clear memories. More like signals. A tightening in her throat when a text went unanswered. A shallow breath when someone's tone shifted. That sudden heat behind her eyes when she heard, I'm just tired, and knew it meant, I don't have room for you right now. She used to think she was too sensitive. That something was wrong with her. That she should be easier, calmer, cooler. More like the women who didn't flinch at distance. But the truth is, the body doesn't flinch for no reason. It learns patterns. It learns exits. It learns what happens right before you're left. Even when nobody walks out. Lucy could be sitting in a restaurant with someone smiling across the table. And still feel abandoned. Because abandonment isn't only an event. It's a climate. And her body had lived in that climate long enough to expect the weather to turn. Sometimes it showed up as tension in her shoulders. As if she were bracing for an impact that never came. Sometimes it showed up in her stomach. A slow, sick ache when she tried to ask for care. And sometimes it showed up in sleep. She would fall asleep exhausted. Then wake up at 3:12 a.m. with her heart already racing. As if her body had been running while she was unconscious. No dream she could remember. Just the feeling of being too alone. That's what emotional unavailability does. It doesn't just hurt your feelings. It rewrites your nervous system. It teaches your body to stay on alert. For the moment warmth disappears. Lucy learned to read silence like a threat. A scene with no reply. A delayed, sorry, busy. A plan that didn't get confirmed. Her body would react before her mind could explain it. Hands cold. Jaw tight. Breath shallow. And then, almost automatically, she'd do what she always did. Make herself smaller. Lower the request. Erase the question. Pretend she didn't need anything. Because her body had learned. Need equals risk. And risk, in her life, often ended the same way. With her alone, trying to act like she wasn't. Even the scar on her shoulder. It wasn't just a scar. It was a reminder of how pain stores itself. Not only in skin, but in posture. In the way she held her arms close. As if protecting a part of herself no one promised to be gentle with. In the way she smiled too fast. To stop someone from seeing her crack. In the way her voice softened at the exact moment she wanted to speak up. As if her body believed loud truth would make people leave. That's the cost of staying in relationships where you're half-held. You don't just lose the person. You lose your ability to relax inside love. You start flinching at affection. Because you're waiting for it to be taken back. Lucy didn't notice all of this at once. It was gradual. Subtle. Like a house that looks fine from the street. But inside, every floorboard creaks. Because something has been shifting for years. And now, one accidental photo had brought her face to face with what her body already knew. She wasn't dramatic. She wasn't too much. She was someone whose nervous system had been surviving abandonment in slow motion. The cost of staying, his silence. Ethan's silence wasn't empty. It was occupied. Occupied by rules he never wrote down, but obeyed like religion. Don't react too fast. Don't say too much. Don't let anyone know they can reach you. Because once someone learns they can reach you, they will try. And Ethan didn't trust himself with being tried. From the outside, his quiet looked controlled, solid, even attractive. That calm, unreadable masculinity people confuse with strength. But inside, silence had a cost. It cost him connection. He would sit across from someone who loved him and feel nothing he could name. Not because nothing was there, but because he had trained his feelings to speak in a language he no longer understood. He could sense a woman's disappointment, the way it thickened the air, the way her voice softened and tightened at once. And instead of stepping closer, Ethan would step inward. He would go still. He would become careful. He would become polite. Because politeness is safer than intimacy. Intimacy asks questions. Politeness offers exits. He told himself he was being respectful. Not intrusive. Not dramatic. But the truth was simpler. He didn't know what to do with the weight of another person's need. Need felt like blame. Need felt like a test he could fail. Need felt like the moment someone would look at him and say, "You're not enough." So he stayed silent. And the silence did what silence always does. It made other people fill in the meaning. They assumed he didn't care. They assumed he was hiding something. They assumed they were asking for too much. And Ethan let them assume it. Because it kept him from having to explain what he couldn't explain. That he was afraid of being needed. Not because he didn't want to be loved, but because love, to him, had always come with pressure. Show up. Perform. Be strong. Be useful. His silence was his way of refusing the performance. But it also became his way of refusing the person. That's the cost. When you don't speak your fear, you make it someone else's loneliness. Ethan had lost relationships that ended without yelling. Without accusations. Without clarity. A woman would simply get tired. She'd stop asking. Stop trying. Stop leaning in. And Ethan would feel a strange relief. Like he could breathe again. Followed by something colder. Regret, arriving late. Because by the time he wanted to reach out, the distance was already part of the relationship. He'd scroll through old messages and notice patterns he hadn't noticed in real time. How often she tried to connect. How often he answered with facts. How rarely he offered warmth. And he would tell himself, "Next time I'll do better." But next time was another way of staying silent. Now, with Luce's photo, Ethan felt the same old mechanism trying to take over. Say something safe. Say something small. Don't risk intimacy. But the longer he stared, the more he recognized the real cost of his silence. It didn't protect him. It just delayed pain and multiplied it. It turned people into strangers, while they were still close enough to touch. And it turned him into a man who could be loved, but not felt. That was the scar he carried. Not on skin, but in the spaces where words should have been. The message that came back. The phone vibrated once, and Luce's whole body answered. Not with movement. With electricity. Her hand reached for it, then stopped midair. As if touch itself could change the outcome. As if reading it would make it real, in a way she wasn't ready for. She turned the screen over. One notification. From Ethan. No heart. No lol. No softening emoji to make it harmless. Just a message. Lucy inhaled, too shallow, then tried again. Slower. Because she already knew. Whatever was behind that screen would land somewhere deep. Her thumb hovered. A tiny tremor she hated herself for. And then, she opened it. Ethan's message didn't start with a question. It didn't start with concern that felt rehearsed. It started with truth, plain, careful, unprotected. Lucy, I saw it. And I'm not going to pretend I didn't. She blinked. Once. Twice. Her mind searched for the familiar sting. The joke, the dodge, the polite distance. But it wasn't there. Another line appeared. I don't know what happened to you. But I know what it looks like to carry something alone. Lucy's throat tightened. Not from fear. From confusion. Because she had prepared for abandonment. For silence. For the cold. She hadn't prepared for someone to stay with what she showed. Her eyes moved down. I've got scars too. Not the kind people see. The kind you learn to hide until you forget you're hiding. That sentence hit her like a hand on a bruise, gentle but exact. Lucy felt heat behind her eyes. Immediate and unwelcome. Her first instinct was to shut it down. To reply with something light. To make it casual. Sorry, wrong send. Haha, ignore that. But the message had opened a door she didn't know how to close politely. Because Ethan wasn't offering a fix. He wasn't asking her to explain. He wasn't making it about him. He was doing something rarer. He was mirroring. And mirroring is dangerous when you've learned to survive by hiding. Lucy's fingers curled around the phone. Her heart started doing that old math. If I respond honestly, will he disappear after? She kept reading, almost against her will. If you want to talk, really talk, I'm here. And if you don't, I'll still be here. I just didn't want you to feel like you sent that into a void. Void. That word cracked something open. Because that was her deepest fear. That she was speaking into nothing. That her pain was invisible. That her need was a sound nobody heard. Lucy stared at the message until the letters blurred. Then she realized what was happening inside her. Her body was waiting for the catch. For the turn where it becomes cold. For the moment he takes it back. For the part where compassion becomes distance. But Ethan didn't take it back. He didn't add, but. He didn't soften it into politeness. He simply stayed where he was. A man who had practiced silence. Choosing words instead. Lucy's scream lit her face in the dark. And for a moment she felt something unfamiliar. Not relief. Not safety yet. But possibility. Because the message that came back wasn't an answer. It was a presence. And Lucy didn't know what to do with presence. Because she had spent years training herself to survive without it. 10. Naming the truth, the mirror moment. Lucy stared at Ethan's message like it was a mirror she hadn't agreed to stand in front of. Because a mirror doesn't just reflect your face. It reflects what you've been avoiding. She read the lines again, slowly. And realized something that made her stomach drop in a new way. Ethan wasn't asking for her story. He was offering his. That kind of honesty doesn't feel romantic at first. It feels dangerous. Because when someone meets you in your pain, you can't pretend you were never hurting. Lucy's thumb hovered over the keyboard. Not to type. To decide. Should she keep being the low-need version of herself? The one who smiles, deflects, disappears? Or should she name what was actually happening inside her? Naming the truth is a risk. Because once you name it, you can't unknow it. So she didn't start with the scar. She didn't start with the photo. She started with the real wound. She typed, I think I've spent my whole life trying not to be a burden. She paused. Breath caught. Then sent it before she could delete it. On the other side of the screen, Ethan read it and felt something crack, quietly. Because that sentence wasn't dramatic. It was familiar. He stared at it like it was written in his own handwriting. He didn't reply right away. Not because he didn't care. But because he suddenly understood what was being asked of him. Not a solution. Not charm. Presence. He finally typed. You're not a burden. But I know what it feels like to treat yourself like one. And Lucy's chest tightened. Not from pain this time. From recognition. They were looking at the same thing, from different angles. Lucy wrote again, slower. When someone doesn't answer me, my body acts like I'm about to be left. That was the truth she'd never said out loud. Not even to herself. Ethan read it and exhaled, long. Controlled, like he'd been holding his breath for years. Then he named his truth. Not as an excuse. Not as a confession meant to be forgiven. As a fact. And when someone needs me emotionally, my body acts like I'm about to be trapped. Lucy blinked. There it was. The mirror moment. Two nervous systems speaking the same language. Just with different meanings. She feared disappearance. He feared closeness. And suddenly, the past made sense. Every time she leaned in, he went quiet. Every time he went quiet, she shrank. Every time she shrank, he felt relief. And that relief taught her she didn't matter enough to hold. But in this moment, the pattern was visible. And what you can see, you can name. Lucy typed. So I chase, and you freeze. Ethan's response came after a pause, heavy. Honest. Yes. And I hate that it makes you feel alone. Silence after that. Not the old silence. Not the punishing kind. A silence where both of them were finally telling the truth, and letting it sit in the room without running. Lucy felt tears press behind her eyes again, but she didn't apologize for them. She didn't rush to be okay. She just stayed with the feeling. Because naming the truth doesn't fix it immediately. It does something quieter. It stops the gaslighting. It stops the, maybe I'm crazy. It stops the, maybe it's not that bad. It stops the habit of blaming yourself for someone else's absence. Lucy looked at the scar on her shoulder. And understood it wasn't just about skin. It was about the way she'd been taught to doubt her own need. Ethan looked at his own hands, steady, controlled, and understood his silence wasn't neutral. It was a message, too. And for the first time, they weren't speaking around the pain. They were speaking to it. Together. 11 When silence breaks. After they named it. After you chase, and I freeze. Something changed in the air. Not comfort. Not closure. Permission. Because when two people finally tell the truth, the silence that follows isn't the same silence that came before. It's not punishment. It's not avoidance. It's recalibration. Lucy stared at the screen, waiting for the old pattern to snap back. Waiting for Ethan to retreat, to joke, to disappear into busy. But instead, a new message arrived, slow, deliberate. As if he was choosing every word with his hands open. I'm here. And I'm not going to vanish on you tonight. Lucy read it twice. That sentence shouldn't have been so powerful. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't grand. It was consistency. And for someone who grew up translating silence into loss, consistency is a form of love. Her throat tightened again, and she tried to reply with something small. Something safe. But the safe version of her had been running the show for years. And she was tired. So she wrote what felt dangerously honest. I don't know how to do this, without apologizing. Ethan's response came after a pause. Not too fast, not too slow. Then don't. Just stay with me in it. Stay. That word landed like a hand on her back. Steady, not pushing. Lucy's eyes stung. She didn't wipe them right away. Because wiping tears quickly is another kind of silence. It says, nothing's happening here. Don't look. Instead, she let them be. And then she did something she almost never did. She asked. A real question. Not disguised as a joke. Not softened into, if it's not too much. What are you afraid will happen if you let someone get close? Even as she sent it, Lucy's body braced for rejection. For the cold shift. For the disappearing act. Ethan's typing bubble appeared, then stopped, then appeared again. That pause was familiar. But this time, it didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like someone fighting for words. Finally. I'm afraid I'll be needed. And I won't know how to be enough. So I go quiet. And when I go quiet, I hurt people. Lucy stared. Her heart beat once hard. Because he didn't say, "That's just who I am." He didn't turn it into personality. He named it as a pattern. A wound. A choice he wanted to change. She typed slowly, hands trembling with something like relief. "When you go quiet, my body thinks it's the beginning of the end." Ethan replied. "Then I need to learn another way to be here." Another way. That's what happens when silence breaks. Not with shouting, not with drama, but with two people choosing language over defense. Lucy realized she was hearing Ethan's inner world for the first time. Not the polished version. Not the competent version. The real one. And Ethan realized he was watching Lucy stop shrinking in real time. Not becoming demanding. Becoming visible. That was the miracle. Not romance. Not resolution. Visibility. They didn't solve each other's histories. They didn't promise forever. But they did something that rewires a relationship at its core. They stayed in the moment long enough to let the silence turn into words. And the words turn into something that could be held. 12. The fear of being seen. Being seen sounds like a gift. Until you've lived through what people do once they see you. Lucy could feel it happening in her body as she stared at the screen. Not panic exactly. More like exposure. Like standing under bright light in a room you thought was dark. Ethan's words were steady. Honest. Present. And instead of relaxing, Lucy felt a strange resistance rise. Because being seen doesn't just mean being understood. It means you can't hide behind the version of yourself that survived. She typed, then erased. Typed again, then erased. Not because she didn't have feelings. Because she had too many. And all of them led back to the same fear. If I show him the real me, he might stay. And that was terrifying. People think the fear is being left. But sometimes, the deeper fear is being kept. Because being kept means you'll be known. And being known means you'll be asked to stop performing strength. Lucy had been performing for years. Performing, fine. Performing, easy. Performing, low need. The kind of woman you can date without having to change. Without having to soften. Without having to grow up emotionally. And now Ethan was offering her something unfamiliar. A space where she didn't have to perform. That should have felt safe. But it made her feel naked. She finally typed. I don't know how to be real without feeling ashamed. Shame. The quiet emotion that lives under so many habits. Ethan read it, and for a moment he didn't answer. Not from avoidance. From recognition. Because he knew shame too. He just wore it differently. He replied. I'm scared of being seen too. I learned to be impressive so no one would look deeper. Lucy's chest tightened. Because that was the line between them. Two different masks built for the same purpose. Her mask said, don't ask for anything. His mask said, don't come close enough to need me. And both masks were made from the same material. Fear. Lucy stared at the phone and felt the oldest question inside her rise. What if I'm not worth staying for once I'm fully known? Not the polished parts. Not the good mood parts. The parts that ache. The parts that need. She typed another message, slower, more vulnerable than she wanted to be. When you said you wouldn't vanish? My first thought was, he doesn't know me well enough to promise that. Ethan's reply came carefully, like he was approaching an animal that had been hurt. Then let me know you. Slowly. And if you get scared, tell me. Don't disappear on yourself. Don't disappear on yourself. Lucy swallowed. Because that's what she did, she disappeared internally long before anyone else could leave her. She'd stop speaking. Stop hoping. Stop expecting. She'd become smaller so rejection would have less to hit. But in this moment, Ethan was asking her for something that felt almost impossible. Stay visible. And visibility is risky. Because it requires trust in time. Not a single sweet message. Not one good night. Time. Lucy felt tears again, but this time they weren't just grief. They were grief mixed with fear. The fear of stepping into something she wanted. She typed one last line, honest in a way that made her hands shake. I'm scared you'll see everything and decide I'm too much. Ethan answered. And I'm scared you'll see my silence and decide I'm not enough. So maybe we stop deciding alone. The fear of being seen didn't disappear. It softened, just slightly, because for the first time, Lucy wasn't carrying it by herself. And for the first time, Ethan wasn't hiding behind quiet. They were both standing in the light. Eyes open. Hands shaking. But still, there. 13 Quiet healing begins. Healing didn't arrive like relief. It didn't feel light. It didn't feel safe. It didn't feel like a solution. It felt quiet. Lucy noticed it first in her breath. For the first time that night, she wasn't holding it. No tight inhale. No bracing exhale. Just air. Moving in and out. Without asking permission. She hadn't fixed anything. Nothing had been resolved. Ethan hadn't promised forever. She hadn't promised to stop being afraid. But something subtle had shifted. She wasn't alone inside the moment anymore. That's how quiet healing begins. Not with certainty. With companionship. Ethan didn't rush the space between messages. He didn't fill it with reassurance or plans. He simply stayed available. And Lucy realized how rare that was. Not availability as performance. Not, I'm here, followed by withdrawal. Just presence without pressure. She typed slowly, noticing her hands weren't shaking as much. I don't feel better yet. But I don't feel as scared. Ethan read that and didn't try to improve it. He replied. That sounds like the beginning of something honest. Honest. Not healed. Not whole. Honest. Lucy leaned back against the couch and closed her eyes. Her body was still alert. But not alarmed. Like an animal that hasn't decided it's safe. But has decided not to run. Quiet healing doesn't erase patterns overnight. It introduces choice where reflex used to live. Lucy felt the reflex to apologize again. And noticed it. Without obeying it. Ethan felt the reflex to retreat into silence. And stayed. That was new. No declarations. No emotional flooding. Just two people practicing something unfamiliar. Staying present when nothing dramatic was happening. Lucy typed one more message, simple, unadorned. Thank you for not disappearing. Ethan paused before responding, then wrote. Thank you for letting me be here. Even when it's uncomfortable. Uncomfortable. Healing isn't warm at first. It's awkward. It's quiet. It's learning how not to abandon yourself while someone else is watching. Lucy realized she wasn't scanning for danger anymore. She wasn't preparing for the drop. She was just there. And Ethan realized he wasn't performing steadiness. He was experiencing it. No one had asked him to be strong. No one had asked him to fix anything. He could simply exist without disappearing. That's when quiet healing truly begins. Not when the pain is gone. But when it's no longer faced alone. Not when fear disappears. But when it's met with patience instead of silence. Lucy didn't know where this would lead. Ethan didn't either. But for the first time, uncertainty didn't feel like danger. It felt like space. And in that space, without vows, without promises, something tender started to breathe. 14 Releasing the old contract. Lucy realized something that night. Something she had never put into words. She had been living under an old contract. Not a paper one. A silent one. A contract she signed as a child, without knowing. It said, if you want people to stay, don't need too much. If you want love, be easy to love. If you feel pain, hide it quickly. If someone pulls away, shrink first. That contract had protected her. It kept her from asking questions that might break her heart. It kept her from wanting what she couldn't guarantee. It kept her from the humiliation of hoping out loud. But protection has a price. Because the same contract that kept her safe also kept her unseen. Lucy looked at her own hands and noticed how often she held herself back. How often she tightened her voice. softened her words, swallowed her truth. She thought she was being mature. But maturity doesn't mean erasing yourself. It means staying present while being real. And for Lucy, being real felt like rebellion. She typed one sentence to Ethan that was less of a message and more of a vow to herself. I think I've been negotiating for scraps and calling it love. She stared at the line, heart pounding, waiting for shame to hit. But it didn't. Instead, clarity came. Ethan read it, and something in him turned over, slowly. Because he had his own contract. His contract said, if you want to survive, don't rely on anyone. If someone needs you, give them solutions, not softness. If closeness feels heavy, go quiet. If you feel too much, lock it down. It had protected him too. It kept him from being disappointed. It kept him from being exposed. It kept him from the terrifying risk of depending. But it also kept him alone. He replied, carefully, I think I've been offering distance and calling it peace. Lucy read that and felt her breath catch. Because in one exchange, they had named the contracts that were running their lives. Two people who weren't cruel. Just conditioned. Lucy's fingers hovered over the screen. Releasing an old contract doesn't happen with confidence. It happens with trembling. Because when you let go of the rules that kept you safe, you don't immediately feel free. You feel unprotected. Lucy typed, I don't want to keep proving I'm easy to love. A pause. Then she added, softer. I want to be loved without disappearing. Ethan stared at those words like they were a doorway he'd avoided his whole life. He replied, I don't want to keep hiding behind silence. I want to learn how to stay, even when it scares me. Stay. The word returned again, but now it meant something deeper. Not staying in a relationship out of fear. Not staying in a role. Staying as yourself. Lucy felt the old reflex rise. To apologize for needing. But she watched it, and let it pass. Ethan felt the old reflex rise. To disappear into control. But he stayed with the discomfort. That's what releasing looks like. Not dramatic. Not perfect. Just two people loosening their grip on the beliefs that once kept them alive. Lucy's scar wasn't only a mark of what hurt her. It was a reminder that her body healed. And now, she was giving her heart permission to heal in a new way too. Not by becoming smaller. By becoming true. 15 Not every scar needs a story. There was a moment, quiet, almost forgettable, when Lucy realized she didn't need to explain herself anymore. Not every scar needed a narrative. Not every mark needed a meaning that made sense to other people. Some things had happened. Some things had hurt. And that was enough. She noticed how often she used to prepare explanations in advance. Just in case someone asked. Just in case someone doubted. A story to justify her sensitivity. A timeline to prove her pain was valid. A softened version that wouldn't make anyone uncomfortable. But sitting there, breathing evenly, Lucy felt something loosen. She didn't owe the world a performance of her healing. Ethan sensed it too. He had spent years turning his silences into stories. Stories about independence, focus, strength. Stories that made absence sound intentional. Controlled. Respectable. But silence, stripped of story, was just silence. And scars, stripped of explanation, were just places where life had touched hard. Lucy typed one sentence, then paused. I don't want to keep translating myself. She didn't add reasons. She didn't clarify. Ethan read it and felt relief move through him, slow, unexpected. Because translation is exhausting. It keeps you living in other people's languages. He replied, you don't have to. I don't need the details to take you seriously. That mattered more than comfort. Because when someone doesn't ask you to prove your pain, they're offering trust. Lucy felt the old reflex rise. To fill the space. To explain. To make it neat. But she let the space exist. And in that space, she realized something quietly radical. Her scar didn't need to be understood. To be respected. It didn't need a beginning, middle, and end. It didn't need a lesson. It was simply a boundary, a place where she would no longer negotiate herself smaller. Ethan, on his side of the screen, was having a parallel realization. He didn't need to justify his quiet with productivity. He didn't need to make his restraint admirable. He could say less. And mean more. He typed. I'm learning that I don't have to explain why I'm careful. I just have to be honest about what I can offer. Offer. Not promise. Not performance. Lucy felt her shoulders drop a fraction. Because that's what safety feels like at first. Not warmth, not certainty. But the absence of pressure. They weren't trading trauma. They weren't comparing wounds. They were doing something subtler. They were letting the scars exist. Without turning them into currency. Lucy looked at her shoulder again, not with shame. Not with pride, but neutrality. A scar doesn't ask to be admired. It asks to be left alone. And for the first time, she granted it that. No story. No explanation. Just presence. 16 quiet ending. Staying without gripping. What stayed with Lucy wasn't certainty. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a future sketched in clean lines. It was something quieter. She noticed it in the way she didn't rush to check her phone. In the way her chest stayed soft, even in the waiting. For the first time, staying didn't feel like clinging. And letting go didn't feel like loss. That was new. Ethan felt it too. Not as relief, but as steadiness. He didn't feel the urge to disappear. He didn't feel the urge to perform closeness just to prove he was there. He could stay without gripping. He could be present without promising more than he could hold. They didn't talk all night. They didn't resolve everything. And somehow, that was the point. Because staying without gripping means allowing space for truth to breathe. Space for fear to pass without being obeyed. Space for connection to unfold at its own speed. Lucy realized she wasn't waiting to be chosen anymore. She was choosing herself while allowing someone to stand nearby. Ethan realized he wasn't being cornered by closeness. He was learning that presence doesn't require surrendering himself. No chasing. No freezing. Just two people standing in the same moment. Hands open. Not pulling. Not pushing. Quiet endings don't wrap things up. They leave them alive. And maybe that's what real intimacy looks like. Not a grip. Not a promise. But a willingness to stay, gently. If this story found you in a quiet place, or named something you've been carrying without words, you're not alone. Please share this video with someone who might need it. Leave a comment below, your words matter here. Like the video if it resonated. And subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast for more stories that sit with you, instead of rushing past you. We'll stay. Without gripping.